At the tomb of Lazarus, surrounded by mourners and skeptics, Jesus stood silent for a long moment. The crowd watched, waiting for him to pray. Waiting for him to beg God for a miracle. Waiting for the familiar ritual of petition and supplication that they had been taught was the proper way to approach the divine. But Jesus did not bow his head. He did not clasp his hands. He did not close his eyes and plead with heaven. Instead, he looked up and said something that confused everyone present. Something that would be softened and reinterpreted by those who wrote it down later. "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe." And then he called Lazarus forth. Not with begging. Not with petition. Not with the powerlessness of prayer. But with authority. With certainty. With the direct invocation of reality itself responding to unified consciousness. The crowd was amazed. They thought they had witnessed a miracle granted by God in response to prayer. But they had not. They had witnessed something far more dangerous. They had witnessed the monad call. The mechanism that Jesus actually used. The state from which he operated when he needed reality to respond. And he said explicitly, in front of everyone, that the prayer, the petition, the appeal to an external authority, that was not for him. That was for them. So they could understand in the only framework they knew. But what he actually did, the state from which he actually operated, was something else entirely. Later, when the crowds had dispersed and only his closest disciples remained, John approached him. "Teacher, you said you prayed for the sake of the people. But what were you actually doing?" Because it did not look like prayer. It looked like command. Jesus smiled. A knowing, almost sad smile. "You are beginning to see." Yes. It was not prayer. Prayer is for those who believe they are separate from the source. Prayer is asking. Begging. Hoping that something outside will intervene. But I do not operate from separation. I operate from unity. From the recognition that the Father and I are one. And when you operate from that recognition, you do not pray. You invoke. You call. You speak from the monad itself. And reality responds. John frowned. "But we have been taught to pray. You yourself taught us to pray. Our Father who art in heaven." "Yes," Jesus said. "I taught you to pray because you were not ready for what I am telling you now. Prayer is preparation. It is practice for those who still believe they are separate. But there comes a point when prayer must be released. When you must stop asking and start knowing. Stop begging and start invoking. Stop positioning yourself beneath reality and start recognizing yourself as the expression of the consciousness that creates reality." He paused, looking at John intently. "What I did at Lazarus's tomb, what I do when I heal, when I calm storms, when I speak and reality shifts, that is not prayer. That is the monad call. And it is what the Archons fear most. Because prayer sustains their system. But the monad call collapses it. This teaching was never written in the official Gospels. It was too dangerous. Too destabilizing to the entire structure of religious authority. Because if people knew that prayer was not the mechanism of power, that Jesus operated from something else entirely, that they too could access that same state, the need for intermediaries would disappear. The church would have no purpose. The priests would have no authority. And the construct that depends on human beings believing they are powerless, separate, and dependent would collapse. But the teaching survived. Hidden. Whispered among those who recognized what Jesus was actually demonstrating. And if you are watching this video, if something inside you is stirring as you hear this, then you are ready to understand what Jesus actually used. Not prayer. The monad call. And why the Archons fear it more than anything else. To understand why Jesus did not actually pray, you must understand what prayer is at its core. Prayer is structured separation. It positions you as the petitioner and something else as the authority. You down here. God up there. You lacking. God able to provide. You hoping. God deciding whether to answer. This structure is not accidental. It is intentional. The religious systems that taught prayer, that made it the primary spiritual practice, understood that prayer creates and reinforces dependency. As long as you are praying, as long as you are asking something outside yourself for intervention, you remain positioned beneath reality. You remain powerless. And powerlessness is exactly what the construct needs to maintain control. When you pray, you are affirming separation. You are saying, I am not enough. I do not have what I need. I must appeal to something greater to provide it. And that affirmation, repeated over and over, becomes your reality. You remain locked in lack consciousness. In separation consciousness. In the belief that you are fundamentally incomplete and require external intervention to be whole. Jesus understood this. He saw how the religious authorities used prayer to keep people dependent. To keep them coming to the temple. To keep them tithing, sacrificing, performing rituals, all in the hope that their prayers would be heard, that God would finally answer, that the external authority would grant what they needed. And he rejected it. Not because prayer is evil. But because it is kindergarten. It is preparation. It is training wheels for those who have not yet remembered what they are. But it is not the mechanism of power. It is not what actually shifts reality. And it is not what Jesus used when he needed reality to respond. What Jesus used was the monad call. And the difference is not subtle. It is fundamental. Prayer speaks from lack. The monad call moves from wholeness. Prayer asks. The monad call invokes. Prayer hopes. The monad call knows. Prayer positions you beneath reality. The monad call recognizes you as the expression of the consciousness that creates reality. When Jesus stood at Lazarus's tomb, he did not pray in the sense that most people understand prayer. He did not ask God to raise Lazarus. He did not plead or beg or hope. He thanked. Past tense. I thank you that you have heard me. Not, please hear me. Not, I hope you will answer. But, you have heard me. Already. Done. Complete. And then he explained why he even said that much. I said this on account of the people standing around. Not for himself. Not because he needed to petition an external authority. But because the people watching needed to hear something they could understand. Something that fit their framework of how divinity works. But what he actually did, the mechanism he actually used, was not prayer. It was invocation from unity. He spoke from the recognition that he and the Father were one. Not separate. Not petitioner and authority. But unified consciousness. And from that unity, he called. And reality responded. Not because God granted a request. But because consciousness aligned with itself collapses the gap between intention and manifestation. The monad call is not a technique. It is not something you do. It is a state you operate from. And that state is the recognition of non-separation. The recognition that the consciousness animating you is the same consciousness animating all of reality. That there is no distance between you and the source. That you are not asking something outside yourself to intervene. You are recognizing that what appears outside is an extension of the same unified field that you are. When Jesus calmed the storm, he did not pray for the storm to stop. He spoke to it. Peace. Be still. Not as a request. As a statement. As an invocation. And the storm responded. Not because a separate God intervened. But because Jesus was operating from the recognition that the consciousness within him and the consciousness expressed as the storm were not separate. They were one field. And when consciousness speaks to itself from unity, it responds. This is what the Archons fear. not prayer. Prayer is harmless to them. In fact, prayer feeds them. Because every time you pray, every time you position yourself as powerless and dependent on external authority, you are generating the frequency of separation, of lack, of submission. And that frequency sustains the false realm. It keeps you contained. It keeps you externalized. It keeps you believing you need permission to access power. But the monad call collapses all of that. Because the monad call is not asking. It is not hoping. It is not waiting for permission. It is the recognition that permission is not needed. That you are not separate from the source. That the power you have been praying to is not external. It is what you are. And when you operate from that recognition, when you stop asking and start invoking, the archonic system loses its grip. The Archons need you fragmented. They need you believing you are small, limited, powerless. They need you praying to something outside yourself because that prayer reinforces the separation that gives them access to your consciousness. But when you recognize unity, when you stop asking and start invoking from the monad itself, you become ungovernable. They cannot manipulate what is no longer fragmented. They cannot control consciousness that has recognized its source. After the disciples struggled to understand Jesus teaching about the Father dwelling for months before they finally understood that he was demonstrating something they could access themselves. He stopped because he was in parables. But because he had remembered what they had instruction he would ever give. And one evening, after he had healed yet another person with nothing more than a word, who prayed in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Teacher, but when you pray, when you go into your reality, shut the door. Are you praying to your Father who is in secret? Are you asking the Father to intervene? The disciples had heard this teaching before. Jesus looked at him with an expression that was part compassion, Jesus added something, part frustration. He looked at them and said, I have been showing you what I am telling you. I have been demonstrating over you to pray to a God who is hiding in your room. But you keep interpreting what you see through the lens of what you were taught. To close the door on the external reality respond, and you shut out the noise, the seeking, the externalized consciousness. I must be asking something outside myself to intervene. In the silence, in the secret place within yourself, that is where you will encounter the Father. He gestured to the man who had just been healed, not as something separate away from with joy, but as the presence that has always been asking the Father closer to heal this person, more intimate than your thoughts. I am recognizing that the Father and I are one. That the consciousness within me and the consciousness emanating this person are not separate, but hidden as you. And from that recognition, the monad expressing itself as your awareness. Not as the consciousness that witnesses everything but is touched by nothing. But as what already is beneath the appearance of illness. That is what you are beneath the identity. And when I see it, when I invoke it from that place of unity, the body responds. And until you recognize it, until you go within and see it directly, but because consciousness aligned with itself, seeking. Peter struggled with this. Believing the kingdom taught us somewhere else. You gave us the words. This was the practice. Our Father who art in petition. Yes, prayer as worship of an external deity. I taught you to pray as because you were not ready for this. As recognition, you needed preparation. As the dissolving of external focus, you needed to learn to turn your attention away from the external world, away from material concerns. And Jesus was teaching them that this practice was not about becoming worthy enough to approach God. It begins the process of recognizing that the separation was never real. But it is not the end. That the God they were praying to was not external but internal. He looked at all of them. Not distant but immediate. There comes a point when you must stop asking in heaven, and start but within the very consciousness that was praying. Stop hoping and start invoking. Mary Magdalene understood Stop positioning yourself as separate and recognize unity. So when we feel the presence in the silence, and when you make that shift, when we feel that when you move from prayer to the monad that is the Father, everything changes. That is the monad. Not because you gain new power. Jesus smiled. But because you stop blocking the power that was always there. But be careful. The shift from prayer to the monad call is not about technique. The Father or the monad. It is about the dissolution of a fundamental belief. As if it is something you are separate from the source. Something other than you. As long as that belief exists, the truth is deeper. As long as you experience yourself as a separate individual trying to connect with something greater, it is what you are. You will ask. The awareness that notices the stillness is not separate from the stillness. And sometimes it will seem like your prayers are answered. And that oneness sometimes is the kingdom. It will seem like they are not. That is the monad. And you will remain in the cycle of something you enter, hoping, waiting. But what you recognize but when the belief in separation dissolves, the reason when this teaching is so difficult to grasp is because the mind cannot hold it. That creates reality. The mind operates in separation. Not wrong. It creates subject and object. Not bad. Just unnecessary and experienced. Like training wheels on a bicycle. And when you try to
Useful for
understand
learning.
the teaching that the monad
But
lives
once you have
within
balance,
the mind
they only
immediately
slow you
creates a
down.
duality. The monad call is what happens when the training
monad
wheels come
there,
off, inside me somewhere.
When
you stop asking something
But that
outside
is not
yourself
what
to
Jesus
intervene
taught.
and recognize that what you were
He was
asking
not
is what
teaching
you
that
are.
there is a separate divine
Not
presence
you as the
living inside you
personality,
like a guest in a house.
not you as the body.
He was teaching that the entire
Not you as
concept
the individual
of a
with
separate
a name
you
and a story.
is the illusion.
But you as
That when the
consciousness,
false self dissolves,
as
what
awareness,
remains is not you plus the monad.
as the monad expressing
What
itself through
remains
this
is just the
particular
monad.
form.
Pure
And when you operate
consciousness,
from that recognition,
aware,
when you need reality to shift,
present,
you do not pray.
infinite,
You do not ask
and
permission.
it has been expressing itself
You
as
do
what you
not
call
hope
for
you
intervention
this entire time.
You go within.
This is why he
To
said,
the silence,
before Abraham was,
to the presence
I am.
that is always here.
Not, I was.
And from that place,
not,
you invoke.
I will be.
Not
But
with words
I am.
necessarily. Present tense.
Not with ritual or technique.
Eternal. But with
The
your
consciousness
entire
that
being.
animates all forms,
You call.
that existed before any
And reality
individual identity
responds.
arose, that will remain
Not because
after
you
all
forced it.
identities dissolve.
Not because you
And
manipulated
that same
it.
consciousness is reading
But
these
because
words
consciousness
right now.
aligned with itself has
Not
no
as something you
resistance.
have. No
But
gap.
as what you are.
No separation
The implication
between
of this
intention
teaching
and
is staggering.
manifestation. It means
Jesus
that everything you
demonstrated
have been
this
seeking
constantly.
is already present.
When he multiplied
Not
the loaves
hidden.
and fishes,
He did
not
not
far
pray
away,
over the food and hope it would
not
be enough.
requiring achievement or
He looked
worthiness
up,
or special
gave
conditions,
thanks for what already was,
just
and distributed
present.
it from the recognition that
Right
lack
here.
is illusion.
right now.
And the food multiplied.
As the awareness that is aware
Not
of this
because
moment.
God performed a miracle.
You have been taught to seek
But because
God in
consciousness
heaven.
operating from abundance
pray
creates
upward.
abundance.
To look beyond
When he
yourself
walked
for
on water,
salvation,
he did
for
not pray
guidance,
for the ability
for
to
truth.
defy gravity.
And all of that
He simply
seeking has been
recognized
moving
that
you
the
away
laws
from
of
what you
physics
already
are
are.
expressions of consciousness.
Because the direction is
And
wrong.
consciousness aligned with
The
itself
kingdom
is not bound by
above.
those laws.
It is within.
It creates them.
It is not in the future.
And when he stepped onto the water
is
from
now.
that recognition, the
It
water
is not
held
something
him.
you become.
Not because God
It is what you
intervened,
already are when you stop
but
pretending
because
to
he
be
was
something
not
else.
operating from the separated consciousness
Jesus demonstrated
that believes
this
water
constantly.
cannot hold a body.
When people came
Every
to him
demonstration
for healing,
was
he
the
did
same.
not tell them to pray harder,
Not prayer.
to become more righteous,
Not
to
asking.
earn God's favor,
Not hoping.
He told them, your
But
faith has
invocation
healed
from
you.
unity. Not his
The
faith.
monad call,
Not God's
and it worked
intervention.
every time.
Their own
Not
recognition.
because Jesus was special,
Their own alignment
but
with what
because
they
he was
already were
aligned.
beneath the illness. And alignment is
And in that
accessible to
recognition,
anyone willing
the
to
body
release the
responded.
belief in separation.
Because the body is an
The
expression
Archons
of
understand this
consciousness.
mechanism far better
And
than
when
most humans
consciousness
do.
recognizes its true
They
nature,
know that
the
prayer
body
is harmless
reflects
to
their
their
truth.
system. In
When
fact,
people came to
they
him
encourage
asking
it.
what they must do to inherit
They
eternal
infiltrate
life,
religious
he did not
structures
give
and
them a list
emphasize
of
prayer
commandments
as the
to
primary
follow.
spiritual practice
He
because
pointed them
prayer
back
keeps
to themselves.
consciousness externalized.
You know the commandments.
It keeps people believing they
and
are
when
powerless.
they said they had kept all the commandments,
It keeps
he
them
said,
waiting for
one
intervention
thing you lack.
rather than recognizing their
Go,
own authority.
sell all that you have. But the monad call
Not
is
because
different.
poverty is holy.
The monad call
But because
collapses the
attachment to
separation
external
that the
things,
Archons
even
depend
good
on.
things, keeps you
It removes
externalized.
the gap between human
Keeps
consciousness
you believing
and
that your
source completeness
consciousness
depends on something outside
And when
yourself.
that gap collapses, the
And until you
Archons
release
lose
their
their
leverage,
leverage.
until you turn
They
within and
lose their
recognize the
access.
monad that needs nothing
They
external
lose their
to be
ability
whole,
to
you
manipulate.
cannot inherit eternal life.
This is why Jesus
Because
said the
eternal
Archons
life
fear
is
it.
not a reward.
Not because the
It is
monad
recognition.
call attacks them.
Recognition
But because
that what
it
you
makes
are is
them
not
irrelevant.
bound by time, not
When
limited
you are
by
praying,
form,
not
when you are
dependent
asking
on
something
anything
outside
external.
yourself for help,
The
you are
practical
generating the
application of
frequency
this
of
teaching is
powerlessness,
simpler than the
of
mind wants
dependency,
it to be.
of lack. The mind
And that
loves
frequency
complexity
is what
the Archons feed
It
on.
loves techniques,
They
practices,
amplify it.
paths to follow.
They use it to keep
Because
you contained.
complexity keeps it engaged.
But when you
keeps
stop
it
praying
seeking,
and start
keeps it
invoking,
in control.
when you recognize unity and
But the
operate from
recognition that the
itself,
monad lives
you
within
stop
you requires
generating
something
that
else.
frequency. Not
You
more
stop
doing,
feeding the system.
less doing.
And the Archons
Not
cannot
more
manipulate
seeking.
consciousness that is not
Recognition
fragmented.
of what is already present
They
when
cannot
seeking
access
stops.
awareness that has recognized
Jesus
its
taught
source.
this through the practice of stillness.
This is the threat.
Go into
Not
your
that
room.
you will fight them.
Close the door.
But that you will make them irrelevant.
and be silent. And the way you make
Not
them
silent
irrelevant
as
is
in
by
suppressing
releasing
thoughts.
prayer and activating the monad
But silent
call.
as in withdrawing
By
attention
stopping
from the
asking
external,
and starting
from
the
the
knowing,
seeking.
from the constant movement
By
towards
withdrawing
something
from the
else.
paradigm of separation
And in that
recognizing
silence,
unity.
notice what remains.
The religious authorities
Not as
understood
an
this threat
experience,
even if they did not understand
not
the
as
mechanism.
something you feel or see or
They
hear.
saw Jesus operating
but
from
as the
authority
awareness
rather
that
than
is aware.
submission.
The
They saw
presence
him
that is
bypassing
present,
their mediation,
the
their
consciousness
rituals,
that is
their
conscious.
control.
It has
They
no
saw him
qualities,
teaching others to do the same.
no characteristics,
And they eliminated him for
no
it.
form.
Not
But
because
it
he
is
was
undeniable.
undeniable, but because
It
he
is
was
what is
demonstrating